While the townsfolk mocked Sarah's desperate attempts to quiet her crying baby, a feared Apache warrior stunned everyone by gently lifting the child and declaring him son. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go! In the harsh shadow of the Arizona mountains, beneath a relentless summer sun, Sarah Matthews stood with shoulders bent not by the weight of the cloth-wrapped bundle against her chest, but by the crushing burden of whispers that followed her through the dusty streets of Willow Creek. The child, her son Thomas, whimpered softly, his tiny fists curled against her threadbare blouse as she shifted him from one hip to the other. "Hush now," she murmured, her voice catching as she tried to soothe him while fumbling with the packages she'd just purchased at Wilson's general store. "Just a little longer, my sweet boy." The year was 1873, and the mining town of Willow Creek, Arizona Territory, had little mercy for a woman alone, especially one with a 6-month-old child and no husband to speak of. Not anymore. "Mrs. Matthews!" The voice of Edith Wilson, the storekeeper's wife, cut through the afternoon heat. "You've forgotten your sugar." Sarah turned, hair falling from her hastily pinned bun, exhaustion etched into every line of her face despite her youth. At 24, grief had already hollowed her cheeks and dimmed the sparkle that once danced in her green eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson," she said, reaching for the small paper-wrapped package. Thomas chose that moment to let out a piercing wail, his patience finally exhausted by the heat and discomfort. The sound drew the attention of several women gathered near the water pump in the town square. "That child needs a father's discipline," said one, loudly enough to ensure Sarah would hear. "My Harold never permitted such displays from our children." "What can you expect?" replied another, adjusting her bonnet with hands that had never known hard labor. "A woman wasn't made to carry a man's responsibilities. It's unnatural." Sarah's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes downcast. 6 months since Robert had been crushed in the mine collapse. 6 months of struggling to keep their small cabin, of taking in laundry and mending, of enduring charity she couldn't afford to refuse, and judgment she couldn't afford to challenge. "Some say the child won't last the winter," whispered a third woman, this one younger but no less cruel. "Without a man's provision—" "That's enough, Martha," interrupted Mrs. Wilson, but the damage was done. Sarah clutched Thomas tighter as his cries grew louder. She needed to get home, to feed him and put him down for a nap, but the packages were slipping and her arms ached from carrying him all morning while she worked. For a moment, she swayed on her feet, dizzy with fatigue. "Here, let me help you with those." The voice came from behind her, deep and resonant with an accent that immediately identified its owner as not from Willow Creek. Sarah turned to find herself looking up at a tall figure silhouetted against the sun. Kohana stood nearly a head taller than most men in town, his broad shoulders straight beneath a cotton shirt worn with fringed buckskin vest. His black hair was pulled back with a leather thong, revealing sharp cheekbones and eyes that missed nothing. The whispers changed tone immediately. "Apache," someone murmured, the word carrying both fear and fascination. Kohana was known to the townsfolk. He came every few weeks to trade with Wilson, bringing finely tanned hides and sometimes meat or medicinal herbs. Unlike most Apache in the territory, he spoke English well, learned, it was said, from a cavalry officer who'd befriended him years before. The town tolerated his presence because Wilson vouched for him, and because, despite widespread distrust of natives, no one could deny that his goods were superior. "I don't need," Sarah began, but Thomas's crying reached a fevered pitch, and one of her packages slipped, spilling cornmeal across the dirt. "Your child is tired," Kohana said simply, as if stating a fact no one else had noticed. Then, before Sarah could protest, he set down the rifle he carried and reached for Thomas. The women near the water pump gasped. Sarah froze, torn between instinctive fear and desperate need for assistance. Kohana waited, hands outstretched, but not moving to take the child without permission. "I have held many children," he said, his dark eyes meeting hers, "including my sister's sons." Something in his steady gaze made Sarah's decision for her. She carefully handed Thomas to him, watching as Kohana cradled her son with surprising gentleness, one large hand supporting the baby's head. The change was immediate. Thomas, who had been wailing inconsolably, quieted as Kohana settled him against his broad chest. The baby's sobs diminished to hiccups, then to soft, contented breathing as he stared up at the stranger's face with wide, curious eyes. "He has strong spirit," Kohana said, his voice low enough that only Sarah could hear, like eagle's cry. The women by the pump stared in undisguised shock. Some made the sign of the cross. Others whispered behind raised hands. Sarah felt their judgment intensify, but something stronger stirred within her, relief that her son had found comfort, even if from unexpected arms. "How did you do that?" she asked, gathering her fallen package and brushing dirt from the spilled cornmeal. Kohana's expression remained solemn, but a warmth touched his eyes. "Children know true heart. They feel safety." He shifted Thomas slightly, and the baby grabbed a finger with surprising strength. "He is not afraid, because he has no reason to be." Mrs. Wilson approached cautiously, her normally pinched expression softened by confusion. "Sarah, dear, perhaps you should take your son now. Mr. Kohana surely has business to attend." "The child rests," Kohana replied before Sarah could speak. "I will carry him. Where is your home?" Sarah hesitated. Accepting help from the storekeeper's wife was one thing. Allowing an Apache warrior to escort her home was quite another in Willow Creek. But Thomas looked more peaceful than he had all day, and her arms ached from the morning's laundry work. 2 streets north, the small cabin with blue shutters, she said finally, ignoring Mrs. Wilson's sharp intake of breath. Kohana nodded once and began walking. His stride measured to match Sarah's shorter steps. She fell in beside him, conscious of the stairs following them through town. The whispers grew, spreading from the water pump to the barber shop, from the saloon to the assayer's office. By tomorrow, she knew, the entire settlement would be buzzing with this new scandal. "Your husband," Kohana said, as they turned onto the quieter residential street. It wasn't a question, but Sarah answered anyway. "Died in the mine collapse last winter. Mercury load." Kohana's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "I know this mine. Bad rock. Bad air." He glanced down at Thomas, who had drifted to sleep against his chest. Men should not dig so deep for shiny metal. They reached the small cabin Robert had built when they first arrived in Willow Creek, full of dreams of striking it rich. The blue shutters, once vibrant, were now faded and peeling. The small garden struggled against the Arizona heat. Half the plants withered despite Sarah's daily watering. "This is home," she said unnecessarily, climbing the 2 wooden steps to the porch. She set down her packages and turned to take Thomas. Kohana didn't immediately relinquish the child. He studied the sleeping boy's face with an intensity that made Sarah nervous. "He has his father in him," he said finally. Sarah blinked back sudden tears. "Did you know Robert?" "I saw him at trading post. He was fair man, paid good price, no cheating." Kohana carefully transferred Thomas to his mother's waiting arms. "Fair men are rare here." As Sarah settled Thomas against her shoulder, she noticed a small crowd gathering at the end of her street. Curious neighbors drawn by the unusual sight of the Apache at a white woman's home. Among them stood Sheriff Mills, his hand resting casually on his holstered pistol. "You should go," Sarah said quietly. "The sheriff—" "I know this man," Kohana interrupted, his tone flat. "He does not worry me." Nevertheless, he stepped back from the porch, retrieving his rifle from where it hung across his back. "Your son needs milk and rest. The package there," he gestured to one of her parcels, "has flour with worms. Do not use." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "How could you know that?" A ghost of a smile touched Kohana's lips. "I have eyes." He reached into a small pouch at his belt and withdrew something wrapped in a corn husk. "For the child, when teeth come. Good medicine." She accepted the small package hesitantly. "I don't understand why you're helping me." Kohana's dark eyes held hers for a long moment. "Many seasons ago, a white woman helped my sister when her child came too early. Good is good. Blood is blood." He looked past her to where the sheriff now approached with determined strides. "I return in 7 suns. Bring better flour." With that, he turned and walked away, his back straight, his steps unhurried despite the sheriff's approach. Sarah watched him go, the small bundle of medicine clutched in one hand, her sleeping son in the other. "Mrs. Matthews," Sheriff Mills said as he reached her porch, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man used to being obeyed, "was that Indian bothering you?" Sarah looked at the retreating figure of Kohana, then down at Thomas, still sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. She thought of the women at the pump, of their cruel words and crueler judgments. She thought of the worm-infested flour Kohana had somehow detected, saving her precious money and possibly her son from illness. "No, Sheriff," she said firmly. "He was helping me carry my packages, and my son." Mills frowned, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. "Mrs. Matthews, it's not appropriate for a woman in your situation to accept assistance from someone like him. People will talk." A bitter laugh escaped before Sarah could stop it. "People already talk, Sheriff Mills. They haven't stopped since Robert died." She shifted Thomas higher on her shoulder and reached for her door. "Good day to you." She closed the door on his startled expression, leaning against it as tears of exhaustion and defiance threatened to spill. Thomas stirred against her, his small hand clutching at her collar. "It's all right, my love," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his downy head. "We're home now." And for the first time in months, Sarah felt something other than despair when she spoke those words, something that, if not quite hope, was at least its distant cousin. True to his word, Kohana returned exactly 7 days later. Sarah was hanging laundry in the small yard behind her cabin, Thomas sleeping in a wooden cradle she'd placed in the shade of the lone cottonwood tree. The morning was still cool, though the relentless Arizona sun would soon burn away the comfortable temperature. She worked quickly, pinning damp sheets and dresses to the line, laundry from the hotel that provided her meager but necessary income. A shadow fell across the grass, and Sarah turned, a damp shirt clutched in her hands. Kohana stood at the edge of her yard, a burlap sack slung over one shoulder. Unlike his previous visit, he wore a battered cavalry hat, the wide brim shading his face from the sun. It made him look somehow both more and less threatening, the hat a nod to white customs, yet the way he wore it distinctly his own. "You came back," she said, surprise evident in her voice despite his promise. He nodded once, then gestured toward Thomas. "The child sleeps well." "Yes, the medicine you gave me." Sarah hesitated, then continued, "It helped. His first tooth came through 2 nights ago." Kohana set down the burlap sack and approached the cradle with measured steps. He stood looking down at the sleeping baby for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "He grows strong," he said finally. "This is good." Sarah finished hanging the shirt, then wiped her damp hands on her apron. Would you like some coffee? It's not very good, I'm afraid." If her invitation surprised him, Kohana didn't show it. "Yes," he said simply. She led him to the small porch where a pot of coffee had been warming on a brazier since sunrise. The cabin was too hot for cooking inside during summer days. She poured the dark liquid into 2 mismatched cups. offering him one. Kohana accepted it with a small nod of thanks, but didn't immediately drink. Instead, he retrieved the burlap sack and extended it to her. Flour, no worms, and dried meat. Good for milk. Sarah stared at the sack, then at him. I can't accept this. Why? The directness of the question caught her off guard. Because I can't repay you. Kohana's expression remained impassive, but his eyes held something like amusement. I do not ask payment. Then why? He took a sip of coffee before answering, his gaze traveling beyond her yard to the mountains in the distance. Your husband died bringing gold from the earth. My brother died protecting gold miners from my people. His eyes returned to hers. Both died for nothing worth dying for, but they leave behind. He gestured toward the cradle. Life continues, should be honored. Sarah's throat tightened. It was more words than she'd heard him speak at once, and they carried the weight of shared understanding. Your brother, scout for bluecoats, he said. Many seasons ago, he believed peace was possible. A faint bitterness colored his tone. He was wrong. From the cradle came a soft whimper as Thomas began to stir. Sarah moved to check on him, but Kohana was already there, one large hand gently rocking the wooden frame. The motion calmed the baby, who blinked sleepily up at the towering figure above him. He knows you, Sarah said, surprised. Children remember, Kohana replied. He tentatively extended a finger, which Thomas immediately grasped. A rare smile transformed Kohana's stern features. Strong hands. We'll be good hunter someday. The peaceful moment shattered at the sound of horses approaching. Sarah tensed, recognizing the clipped gait of Sheriff Mills' bay gelding. Kohana heard it too, his body instantly alert, though his expression remained calm. You should go, Sarah said urgently. The sheriff. I have done nothing wrong, Kohana replied, though he straightened and stepped away from the cradle. Trading is permitted. That won't matter if he... She broke off as Sheriff Mills appeared around the corner of the cabin, accompanied by Wilson from the general store and Reverend Collins from the small church in town. Mrs. Matthews, the sheriff called, his voice artificially pleasant, though his eyes narrowed at the sight of Kohana. We've come to speak with you about a matter of some concern. Sarah moved instinctively toward Thomas, lifting him from his cradle. What concern would that be, Sheriff? The three men exchanged glances before Reverend Collins stepped forward, hands clasped before him like a man about to deliver a sermon. My dear, several members of the congregation have expressed discomfort regarding your association with this. He gestured vaguely toward Kohana. Individual. I have a name, Kohana said quietly. The Reverend flushed, but continued as if he hadn't spoken. A widow woman living alone is already in a precarious position, Mrs. Matthews. To invite further scandal by entertaining a savage. He brought me flour, Sarah interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended, and dried meat, because my son needs food and I can barely afford enough on what I earn doing your wife's laundry. Wilson had the grace to look uncomfortable. Sarah, no one's saying you can't accept charity. But surely there are more appropriate sources. Like whom? Sarah demanded. The same women who whisper that my son won't survive the winter, who say I'm an unfit mother because I have no husband. That charity comes with judgment I cannot afford, Mr. Wilson. Nevertheless, Sheriff Mills cut in, his hand resting meaningfully on his holstered pistol, we can't have him making regular visits here. People are talking, Sarah, the kind of talk that could make things very difficult for you and your boy. Thomas began to fuss, sensing his mother's distress. Sarah bounced him gently, trying to calm both him and herself. I don't answer to town gossip, Sheriff. Perhaps not, Reverend Collins said, his tone softening to one of practiced concern. "But you do answer to God, my child, and to the welfare of your son. What kind of life will he have if he's raised under the shadow of impropriety?" Kohana had remained silent during this exchange, his face impassive though his eyes were alert to every movement of the men before him. Now he spoke, his deep voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "The child has no father. I bring food so he may grow strong. This dishonors your God." There was no mockery in the question, only genuine curiosity. Reverend Collins bristled. "It is not for a heathen to question Christian propriety." "Yet you question my right to help a woman and child," Kohana observed. "Your Jesus fed the hungry. I have read this in your book." The Reverend's face reddened further, but before he could respond, a cry came from the direction of town. A young boy on horseback galloped toward them, his face flushed with excitement. "Sheriff! Sheriff Mills! Riders coming! Army patrol from Fort Whipple!" The sheriff turned, momentarily distracted. "Army? We weren't expecting—" "Lieutenant Hollister's patrol," the boy gasped. "They got Apache prisoners. Says they raided a settlement north of here 3 days ago." Kohana's expression hardened at the boy's words, his body tensing like a drawn bowstring. A shadow passed across his face, something primal and dangerous that made Sheriff Mills' hand drift back to his pistol. "Whose people?" Kohana asked, his voice deceptively calm. The boy, suddenly aware of the Apache standing in the yard, faltered. I don't know, sir. Just said Apache." Sarah clutched Thomas closer, feeling the delicate balance of the moment. She glanced at Kohana, whose eyes had gone distant, calculating. "We should see to this," Sheriff Mills said, already turning his horse. "Wilson, Reverend, I will come also," Kohana stated flatly. It wasn't a request. Mills frowned. "That wouldn't be wise. Those are my people," Kohana said, the words carrying a weight that silenced further protest. "I have right to see." The sheriff exchanged glances with Wilson, then nodded reluctantly. "You stay behind us. And no trouble, you hear?" Kohana gave no acknowledgement beyond retrieving his rifle from where it leaned against the porch. He turned to Sarah, his expression softening almost imperceptibly as he looked at Thomas. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Army men have anger in their hearts. Sarah nodded, watching as the strange procession, the sheriff, the storekeeper, the reverend, and the tall Apache, moved toward town. Thomas squirmed in her arms, his small face scrunching up in preparation to cry. "Shh," she soothed, bouncing him gently. "It's all right." But an uneasiness had settled in her stomach. Nothing about this felt all right. Unable to contain her curiosity and concern, Sarah wrapped Thomas in a light blanket and followed at a distance. By the time she reached the edge of town, a crowd had already gathered in the dusty square. She hung back, not wanting to draw attention to herself or Thomas, who had thankfully fallen back asleep against her shoulder. The army patrol, 6 dust-covered cavalrymen, led by a young lieutenant with a neatly trimmed mustache, had 4 Apache prisoners. 2 men, a woman, and a boy no older than 12, sat atop gaunt horses, their hands bound before them, their faces impassive despite obvious exhaustion and mistreatment. The woman's eye was swollen shut, a dark bruise spreading across her copper skin. Lieutenant Hollister, his blue uniform jacket unbuttoned in concession to the heat, was addressing the gathered townsfolk with the practiced authority of a man who enjoyed having an audience. "Caught them 2 days' ride north," he was saying. "Part of the band that raided the Hamilton homestead. 3 settlers killed, livestock stolen." "How do you know they're the ones responsible?" someone asked from the crowd. Hollister smirked. "They're Apache, aren't they? Found them with Hamilton's horses." He gestured to several animals tethered behind the patrol. "Taking them back to Fort Whipple for questioning, then they'll likely hang." Sarah saw Kohana standing rigidly at the edge of the crowd, his face carved from stone. His eyes were fixed on the prisoners, particularly the young boy whose thin shoulders were held as straight as his bonds would allow. "That's Ahiga's son," came a voice beside her. Sarah started, turning to find Mrs. Wilson standing next to her, a basket of purchased goods on one arm. "Pardon?" Mrs. Wilson nodded toward the boy prisoner. "The youngest one. His father was killed by miners last spring. He and his mother lived peacefully near Walnut Creek until—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "The boy's mother isn't among the prisoners. Likely dead now." Sarah stared at her, surprised by both her knowledge and the note of sympathy in her voice. "How do you know this?" The older woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "My husband trades with them all. Has for 15 years. They're people, Mrs. Matthews, not animals, though many here would disagree." She sighed. "That boy is no raider. He's a child." In the square, Lieutenant Hollister was now discussing arrangements for his men to rest and resupply before continuing to the fort. Sheriff Mills had invited him for a drink at the saloon, and several of the townsmen were already slapping the young officer on the back, congratulating him on his catch. The Apache prisoners remained mounted, ignored except for the private assigned to guard them. The woman swayed slightly, clearly struggling to remain upright. Suddenly, Kohana moved forward, approaching not the prisoners, but Lieutenant Hollister. The crowd parted nervously before him, conversations dying as people nudged each other and pointed. "Lieutenant," Kohana said, his deep voice carrying across the now silent square. Hollister turned, his hand automatically moving to his sidearm when he registered Kohana's presence. "What the devil? These people did not raid Hamilton Farm," Kohana stated clearly, his eyes never leaving the lieutenant's face. A murmur ran through the crowd. The prisoners' heads lifted, their gazes fixing on Kohana with recognition and surprise. "And how would you know that, Buck?" Hollister asked, his tone dismissive, though his eyes were watchful. "Ahiga's son is not warrior," Kohana replied evenly. "He is child. His mother was peacemaker among our people. These others," he gestured to the adult prisoners, "are from Riverband. They do not raid. They fish and grow corn." The lieutenant's face hardened. "Are you calling me a liar, Indian?" "I am saying you are mistaken," Kohana corrected, a dangerous edge to his voice, despite the careful neutrality of his words. "Hamilton horses were stolen, yes, but not by these people." Sheriff Mills stepped forward, clearly anxious to diffuse the tension. "Now see here, Kohana, the lieutenant has—" "They were at the trading post," came a firm voice from behind Sarah. Mrs. Wilson had moved forward, her basket still on her arm but her posture straight as an arrow. "3 days ago, when the Hamilton place was raided, my husband can confirm it. They traded fish and corn for salt and coffee." A shocked silence fell over the square. Lieutenant Hollister's face reddened with anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you can't possibly tell one Apache from another." "I most certainly can," Mrs. Wilson interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had spent decades as the wife of a respected businessman. "I've known that boy since he was born. And that woman there with the bruised face that I'm certain she didn't have when she left our trading post, that's Nasha. She speaks better English than half the men in this square and has never harmed a soul." Sarah watched in astonishment as the storekeeper's wife, whom she had always thought of as politely distant at best, placed herself squarely in opposition to the army officer. Mr. Wilson looked torn between pride in his wife's moral courage and terror at her public defiance. Lieutenant Hollister was clearly unprepared for this challenge to his authority. "Sheriff," he said tightly, "I suggest you control your townspeople. These prisoners are the property of the United States Army and—" "People are not property," Kohana said, his voice like thunder though he hadn't raised it. "Not anymore. Your President Lincoln said this." Thomas chose that moment to wake fully, letting out a piercing wail that cut through the tension like a knife. All eyes turned to Sarah, standing at the edge of the crowd with her crying child. "And here's the other one," Hollister said with a sneer, looking from Sarah to Kahana. "I've heard about you from the patrol that passed through last month. The widow who took up with a savage." Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "I suggest you watch your words, Lieutenant. Slander is still a crime, even for a man in uniform." She moved forward, trying to soothe Thomas, whose cries were growing louder. The baby twisted in her arms, reaching out as if searching for something or someone. His eyes found Kahana, and his small hands stretched toward the tall Apache. Before anyone could react, Thomas let out a clear, distinct sound. "Abba!" It wasn't quite Papa, but it was close enough to send a ripple of shocked whispers through the crowd. Sarah stood frozen, as surprised as anyone by her son's first attempt at a word and his choice of recipient. Kahana's stern expression softened for just a moment as he looked at Thomas. Then, with deliberate slowness, he turned back to Lieutenant Hollister. "These people are innocent," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "I will swear this before your commanders, before your God. Release them." The square held its breath, waiting for the lieutenant's response. Hollister's hand still hovered near his pistol, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Then, from the back of the crowd, another voice rang out, firm, authoritative, and unmistakably military. "I believe that would be the wise course of action, Lieutenant." The crowd parted, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dusty cavalry uniform with captain's bars on his shoulders. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his moustache streaked with grey, and a long scar ran from his temple to his jaw on the right side of his face. Unlike Hollister's carefully maintained appearance, this man looked like he'd seen real battle and carried its marks without vanity. "Captain Monroe," Hollister stammered, instinctively straightening his posture. "Sir, I wasn't expecting—" "Clearly," the captain replied dryly. He walked forward with the measured pace of a man accustomed to command, his spurs jingling softly against the packed dirt of the square. "I was on my way to Fort Whipple with dispatches when I heard about your initiative." His eyes scanned the scene, the bound prisoners, the gathered townspeople, Kahana standing tall and unyielding. His gaze lingered on Sarah and Thomas, a flicker of something unreadable passing across his features. "Lieutenant," Monroe continued, his voice carrying easily across the now silent square, "did it not occur to you to question why Apache raiders would remain so close to the scene of their supposed crime? Or why they would be traveling with women and children? Or perhaps why they would make no attempt to flee when approached by a small patrol?" Hollister's face reddened further. "Sir, with all due respect, these savages are unpredictable, and we found them with Hamilton's horses, which they could have found wandering, or traded for, or any number of explanations that don't involve assuming guilt based solely on race," Monroe interrupted. "Mrs. Wilson's account places these individuals elsewhere at the time of the raid. Do you have any actual evidence to contradict her testimony?" The lieutenant's mouth opened and closed without producing sound. Finally, he managed, "Sir, she's just a storekeeper's wife, hardly a reliable—" "Mrs. Wilson has lived in this territory longer than you've been alive, Lieutenant," Monroe said sharply, "and unlike you, she appears to have taken the time to know the local tribes as people, not merely as potential enemies." He turned to the Apache woman with the bruised face. "Nasha," he said, his voice gentler, "were your people at the Hamilton homestead 3 days past?" The woman sat straighter on her horse, her one good eye meeting the captain's steadily. "No, Captain," she replied in clear accented English. "We were trading at Wilson's, then fishing at Walnut Creek. Soldiers came while we dried fish, said we stole horses, beat my brother when he tried to explain. She gestured to one of the male prisoners whose face was similarly bruised. Monroe nodded, then turned back to Hollister. "Cut them loose, Lieutenant, now." "But, sir, that's an order." Monroe's voice carried the unmistakable edge of a man used to being obeyed. "Unless you'd prefer to explain to the Colonel why you ignored eyewitness testimony and the articles of war regarding treatment of non-combatants." Hollister's jaw clenched, but he gave a curt nod to the private guarding the prisoners. "Release them." As the private moved to cut the bindings, Monroe turned to Kohana. "I thought you would be further north by now." "You know each other?" Sheriff Mills asked, surprise evident in his voice. Kohana's expression remained impassive. "Captain fought with honor in the war, did not kill women and children like some." His eyes flicked meaningfully toward Hollister. "Later, he learned our language, listened when others only shouted." Monroe gave a small, wry smile. "Your Apache is still better than my English, old friend." He turned to address the crowd. "Kohana was a scout for the Union Army during the war. Saved my company from a Confederate ambush near Glorieta Pass. Any man who questions his honor can take it up with me." This revelation sent a fresh wave of murmurs through the gathered townspeople. Sarah watched their expressions shift from hostility to confusion to reluctant respect. Thomas had quieted in her arms, still reaching toward Kohana with small, grasping hands. The Apache boy, now freed from his bonds, slid from his horse and ran to Kohana, speaking rapidly in their native tongue. Kohana placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his reply too quiet for others to hear. Captain Monroe approached Sarah, removing his hat respectfully. "Ma'am, I don't believe we've been introduced. Captain James Monroe, 5th Cavalry." "Sarah Matthews," she replied, shifting Thomas to extend her hand. "And this is my son, Thomas." Monroe shook her hand briefly, then smiled at the baby. "Fine-looking boy you have there, strong, like his mother." His eyes moved to Kohana, then back to Sarah. "And he seems to have found himself a protector." Before Sarah could respond, Reverend Collins stepped forward, his expression a mixture of confusion and indignation. "Captain Monroe, while we appreciate your intervention in this misunderstanding, I feel compelled to point out that the relationship between Mrs. Matthews and this man is causing considerable concern in our community." Monroe regarded the Reverend with the patient expression of someone accustomed to dealing with civilians who thought their opinions mattered to the military. "Is that so? And what relationship would that be exactly?" Collins flushed. "Well, the impropriety of a white widow receiving regular visits from a savage. From a decorated war veteran and respected tribal leader," Monroe corrected mildly, "who appears to be ensuring the welfare of a woman and child in need. Forgive me, Reverend, but I fail to see the impropriety in Christian charity being practiced, rather than merely preached." Several townspeople failed to suppress smiles at this rebuke. Mrs. Wilson actually chuckled aloud, earning a shocked look from her husband. Lieutenant Hollister, clearly eager to reclaim some authority, stepped forward. "Sir, we should proceed to Fort Whipple. The Colonel will want your dispatches, and we need to report this situation." "Indeed," Monroe agreed, "though I believe these people deserve some recompense for their mistreatment." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch, which he handed to Nasha. "For your trouble, please convey my apologies to your people." The woman accepted the pouch with quiet dignity. "The apology of an honorable man is worth more than gold, Captain." As the freed prisoners prepared to depart, Kohana spoke quietly to the boy, who nodded and moved to join Nasha and the others. Then Kohana approached Sarah and Thomas, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "The boy is Kemi," he explained. "His mother was killed when soldiers took them. He has no one now." Sarah's heart constricted at the simple tragedy of those words. What will happen to him? "Nasha will care for him," She is good woman. He hesitated, then added, I must go with them. Make sure they reach their people safely. Thomas chose that moment to reach out again, his small fingers grasping at air as he babbled, Abba, Abba! The crowd had thinned somewhat, but those still present watched this exchange with undisguised interest. Sarah was acutely aware of the stares, the whispers, the judgments forming behind tightly pressed lips. But in that moment, looking at her son's eager face and Kohana's solemn one, she found she cared far less than she had before. Will you come back? She asked quietly. Kohana's dark eyes held hers. Yes. It was not a promise made lightly. She could see that in the set of his shoulders, hear it in the weight he gave the single word. Then we'll be waiting, she replied. After a moment's hesitation, Kohana reached out and gently touched Thomas's cheek with one finger. The baby grabbed it immediately, giggling with delight. The corner of Kohana's mouth lifted in the barest suggestion of a smile. He grows stronger each day, he said, like his mother. Captain Monroe, watching this exchange from a respectful distance, stepped forward. Kohana, if you're escorting these people home, my patrol can ride alongside you for part of the way. Might discourage any further misunderstandings. Kohana nodded his thanks, then turned back to Sarah. 7 sons, he said. I will return. As Kohana moved away to join the freed prisoners, Sarah felt rather than saw the stares of the remaining townspeople. Some were curious, others disapproving, a few, like Mrs. Wilson, surprisingly supportive. He'll be back, Captain Monroe said quietly, now standing beside her. He's a man of his word. Sarah looked up at him, searching his weathered face. You really do know him, don't you? Monroe nodded, watching as Kohana helped Nasha back onto her horse. 10 years now, saved my life more than once. Man like that, he gestured toward Kohana, doesn't give his loyalty easily. But when he does, he trailed off, then smiled at Thomas. Your boy's chosen well. He's not, Sarah began automatically, then stopped herself. The town will always find something to think, Mrs. Matthews, Monroe said with a wry smile. In my experience, it's rarely worth worrying about. As the impromptu procession prepared to depart, the freed Apache, Kohana walking beside them, Monroe's small detachment, and the chastened Lieutenant Hollister, Sarah stood watching, Thomas still reaching toward Kohana with plaintive cries of Abba, Dee, and for the first time since Robert's death, Sarah felt not just the fragile cousin of hope, but something stronger taking root. A certainty that whatever path lay ahead, she and Thomas would not walk it alone. 7 days passed like a slow-moving river, each hour flowing into the next with the inexorable patience of time. Sarah counted them silently, not admitting to herself how often her eyes drifted to the horizon, searching for a tall figure against the endless blue of the Arizona sky. Life in Willow Creek had shifted subtly since the day of Lieutenant Hollister's humiliation. Captain Monroe's public acknowledgement of Kohana's war service had worked a small miracle among some of the townspeople, particularly the veterans who gathered each evening at Jennings' saloon to relive battles long past. To learn that an Apache had fought for the Union, had saved American lives, had been trusted by a respected officer like Monroe, it didn't erase decades of fear and prejudice, but it planted seeds of doubt in fertile soil. Others, however, only hardened in their condemnation. Reverend Collins had delivered a pointed sermon the Sunday after Kohana's departure, speaking at length about the dangers of spiritual corruption through heathen influence. His eyes had found Sarah in the congregation more than once, though he never spoke her name. Martha Prescott, whose husband owned the assayer's office, had crossed the street rather than pass Sarah on the boardwalk. Mrs. Jenkins, wife of the saloon owner, had whispered loudly to her companion when Sarah entered Wilson's store, "Some women have no sense of decency once their husbands are gone." But there were unexpected kindnesses as well. Mrs. Wilson had added an extra cup of sugar to Sarah's order. For the boy, her eyes crinkling with something like approval. Old Mr. Harrington, who'd lost a leg at Shiloh, had tipped his hat to Sarah outside the post office and gruffly offered to mend her porch step, which had begun to rot. No charge, he'd insisted, just being neighborly. On the 7th day, Sarah was kneeling in her small garden, Thomas asleep in his cradle in the shade nearby. The vegetables she'd planted in spring were finally beginning to thrive, green beans climbing their stakes, tomatoes forming on the vines, squash spreading their broad leaves across the carefully tended soil. She worked steadily, pulling weeds, her thoughts drifting between mundane concerns and memories that seemed to shimmer in the heat. Robert's face was becoming harder to recall with perfect clarity. This realization had struck her the previous night as she prepared for bed, bringing with it a wave of guilt that threatened to drown her. She remembered his kindness, his ambition, the way he'd spun dreams of wealth from the harsh reality of a miner's life. She remembered how he'd held Thomas just once before, heading to the Mercury lode for his final shift. But the precise shade of his eyes, the exact curve of his smile, these were fading like footprints in sand. "Mama!" Thomas's voice, still new and delightful in its clarity, pulled Sarah from her reverie. She turned to find him standing in his cradle, tiny hands gripping the edge, bouncing with excitement. His vocabulary had exploded in the past week. "Mama," "no," "more," and a handful of other simple words joining his first, "Abba." "What is it, sweet boy?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron as she moved toward him. But Thomas wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on something beyond her shoulder, his face alight with joy. "Abba, Abba!" Sarah turned, her heart suddenly racing. Kohana stood at the edge of her yard, as still and watchful as the day he'd first approached her outside Wilson's store. But there were differences too. He wore a clean cotton shirt beneath his buckskin vest. His hair was neatly braided with a strip of red cloth woven through it, and in his hands he held a small object wrapped in soft deerskin. "You came back," Sarah said, echoing her words from his previous return. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "I said I would." Thomas was practically vibrating with excitement, reaching both arms toward Kohana and repeating his version of "father" with increasing urgency. "He's been watching for you," Sarah admitted, lifting Thomas from his cradle. "We both have." Something flickered in Kohana's dark eyes, surprise perhaps, or pleasure. He approached with measured steps, stopping a respectful distance away. "For the boy," he said, extending the deerskin-wrapped package. Sarah accepted it, feeling the lightness of the object within. She carefully unwrapped the soft hide to reveal a small carving, a horse, its lines flowing and graceful despite the simplicity of the form. The wood had been polished to a warm glow, smooth enough for small hands to hold without splinters. "You made this?" she asked, running her finger over the curved neck of the tiny horse. Kohana nodded. "Pine, good wood, safe for children." Thomas reached for the toy with eager hands, his face alight with curiosity. Sarah gave it to him, watching as he immediately brought it to his mouth for investigation. "It's beautiful," she said, looking up at Kohana. "Thank you." He inclined his head, accepting her gratitude with quiet dignity. Then, almost hesitantly, he asked, "He is well?" "Growing stronger every day, and talking more," she smiled. "He asks for you, or at least his version of asking." Kohana's expression softened as he watched Thomas gnawing happily on the wooden horse. "He will be tall, like his father?" The question held no jealousy or resentment, only genuine curiosity. "Robert was of average height," Sarah replied, "but my father and brothers were all tall men." "Good. Tall men see father." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with things unsaid. Sarah was acutely aware that they were being observed. Mrs. Prescott's lace curtains twitched in the window across the street. Two men had paused in their conversation outside the saddlery to stare openly. "Would you like some coffee?" Sarah asked finally, gesturing toward the porch. "It's too hot to stay in the sun." Kahana hesitated, his eyes moving to the watching neighbors. "Your people do not approve." "Some don't," Sarah acknowledged. "Others are beginning to. But either way, I find I care less about their approval with each passing day." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by something warmer. Then yes, coffee would be good. They sat on the porch steps, Thomas crawling between them with his new wooden horse, occasionally stopping to offer it to one or the other for inspection. Sarah poured coffee from the pot she kept warm on the brazier, adding a precious spoonful of sugar to Kahana's cup without asking. "The boy and his people?" she inquired after a comfortable silence. "They arrived safely?" Kahana nodded. "Captain Monroe kept his word, rode with us 3 days to Riverlands. Nasha's brother has good place there. Many fish, good water." He sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "Keme is quiet still, but he helps with fishing nets, works hard. He will heal in time." Sarah's heart ached for the orphaned boy. And his mother? Will she be honored properly? The question seemed to surprise Kahana. He studied her face as if seeing something new there. Yes, her spirit was sent to ancestors with proper songs. Nasha made sure. He paused. "It is good you ask this. Most white people think we do not mourn our dead." "I lost my husband," Sarah said quietly. "Grief doesn't belong to any one people. It belongs to all of us." They fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, one built on shared understanding rather than awkward uncertainty. Thomas babbled happily between them, occasionally looking up at Kahana with unmistakable delight. "Well, isn't this a pretty picture?" The harsh voice shattered the peaceful moment. Sarah looked up to find Harold Jenkins, the saloon owner, standing at the edge of her yard. His face was flushed with more than the heat of the day, and his eyes held the glazed look of a man who had been drinking since morning. "Mr. Jenkins," Sarah acknowledged coolly, "can I help you with something?" Jenkins ignored her, focusing instead on Kahana with naked hostility. "Town's talking about you, Indian, about how you've laid claim to a white woman and her child." Kahana didn't rise, didn't change his posture, but Sarah felt him tense beside her. His voice when he spoke was calm, but carried an edge of steel. "I claim nothing that is not freely given." "That's so?" Jenkins sneered. "And what have you given exactly besides making her the town's scandal?" "Mr. Jenkins," Sarah interrupted, standing now with Thomas clutched protectively to her chest, "I think you should leave." "Or what?" Jenkins took a step closer, swaying slightly. "You'll set your pet savage on me? That what you do, Matthews? Trade yourself for protection?" His eyes raked over her with drunken insolence. "Can't say I blame him. Widows get lonely, I hear." Kahana moved then, rising in one fluid motion to position himself between Sarah and Jenkins. He didn't speak, didn't threaten. He simply stood, a silent barrier of flesh and bone and contained power. Jenkins's hand dropped to the pistol at his hip. "Go ahead, Buck. Give me a reason. Been waiting for one of you red devils to step out of line." "Harold Jenkins!" The sharp voice cut through the tension like a knife. Mrs. Wilson stood at the gate to Sarah's yard, a basket over one arm and outrage written across her face. "You will remove yourself from Mrs. Matthews' property this instant, or so help me God. I will inform your wife about that painted lady you visit in Prescott when you're supposedly on buying trips." Jenkins' face paled beneath its drunken flush. "Edith, you don't understand the situation. I understand perfectly well that you're drunk before noon and threatening a war veteran on the property of a respectable widow. Mrs. Wilson replied crisply. "Now go sleep it off before I decide your wife deserves to know exactly how her household money is being spent." For a moment it seemed Jenkins might argue further. His hand still hovered near his pistol, his bloodshot eyes darting between Kohana's impassive face and Mrs. Wilson's stern one. Then, with a muttered curse, he turned and stumbled away. Mrs. Wilson watched him go, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Then she turned to Sarah. "I brought some of those strawberry preserves you admired last market day," she said, as if nothing unusual had occurred. "For the boy. Growing children need sweet things sometimes." She extended the basket toward Sarah, who accepted it with bemused gratitude. "Mrs. Wilson, I don't know how to thank you." The older woman sniffed. "No need for thanks between neighbors, dear." Her eyes moved to Kohana, who still stood protectively near Sarah and Thomas. "Mr. Kohana, I trust your people reached home safely." "Yes, Mrs. Wilson," he replied with formal courtesy. "They send thanks for your testimony. Least I could do." She adjusted her bonnet, preparing to leave. "Oh, and Sarah, the Ladies' Aid Society is meeting tomorrow at my home. We're making quilts for the mission school. I expect you'll join us." It wasn't a question. Sarah blinked in surprise. The Ladies' Aid Society was the heart of Willow Creek's social circle. An invitation was tantamount to social acceptance. Yes, of course," she managed. Mrs. Wilson nodded, satisfied. "1 o'clock sharp. Bring the boy. Mrs. Harrington wants to see how her medicine helped with his teething." With that, she turned and walked back toward town, her posture as straight as a cavalry officer's. When she had gone, Sarah turned to find Kohana watching her with something like amusement in his dark eyes. "The elder women are the same in all tribes," he observed. "They decide, others follow." Sarah laughed, the tension of Jenkins' confrontation dissolving. "I suppose they are." She looked down at Thomas, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, the wooden horse still clutched in one small hand. "He's exhausted himself with excitement." Kohana's gaze softened as he looked at the sleeping child. Without asking, he gently took Thomas from her arms, cradling him with practiced ease. The baby sighed in his sleep, nestling against Kohana's broad chest, as naturally as if he'd always belonged there. "I will put him in his bed," Kohana said quietly. As Sarah watched him carry her son into the cabin, something shifted deep within her, a certainty taking root, as inevitable as the changing seasons. This man, so unlike any she had known before, had crossed boundaries of race and culture to stand beside her and her son, not with demands or expectations, but with quiet strength and gentle hands. And in that moment, Sarah realized that the gossips of Willow Creek had been right about one thing. Thomas had indeed found a father, not in the way they believed, steeped in scandal and impropriety, but in the truest sense of the word. Someone who chose to love and protect a child not of his blood, who saw a need and filled it without hesitation. Family, she was learning, was not always born. Sometimes it was built, one act of kindness at a time. Autumn arrived in Willow Creek with a subtle shift. Mornings grew cooler, the afternoon light took on a golden quality, and the mountains to the north occasionally wore a dusting of early snow on their highest peaks. For Sarah, the changing season brought both comfort and uncertainty. 3 months had passed since that summer day when Kohana had first carried Thomas home. 3 months of gradual, careful integration into each other's lives. Kohana never stayed overnight, a concession to propriety that Sarah appreciated, though she sometimes wondered if it was for her benefit or his own. His people had customs too, after all, and she was learning that Apache courtship could be as formally structured as any Victorian ritual. But he came regularly, appearing every few days with quiet reliability. He brought small gifts, a brace of rabbits, a sack of piñon nuts, once a bolt of soft cotton cloth that must have cost him dearly at the trading post. He helped repair the cabin roof before the autumn rains, built a proper cradle to replace Thomas's outgrown basket, and dug irrigation channels to Sarah's expanding garden. Most importantly, he spent time with Thomas. He showed infinite patience with the boy's increasingly mobile explorations, teaching him to identify birds by their calls, to feel the different textures of leaves and bark. Thomas, now approaching his first birthday, toddle-stumbled after Kohana with devoted determination, his vocabulary expanding to include several Apache words alongside his English. "Marseille," he'd proudly announce, pointing at the moon. "Very good," Sarah would praise, while Kohana nodded with quiet pride. The Ladies' Aid Society meeting had been a turning point of sorts. Sarah had arrived at Mrs. Wilson's neat home with trepidation, Thomas on her hip and uncertainty in her heart. The circle of Willow Creek's most respectable matrons had fallen silent as she entered, their hands stilling on half-sewn quilts and embroidery hoops. Mrs. Wilson had merely raised an imperious eyebrow at her peers. "Well, are we making quilts or statues today, ladies?" Gradually, the women had resumed their work, and Sarah had found herself incorporated into their circle with surprising ease. Mrs. Harrington had immediately appropriated Thomas, examining his new teeth with professional interest and pronouncing him a fine specimen considering. Mrs. Bailey had asked, with only a slight stiffness to her tone, whether Sarah might be willing to teach the group her exceptional buttonhole stitch. Not everyone was welcoming. Martha Prescott and Clara Jenkins pointedly ignored her, but by the meeting's end, Sarah had received invitations to return the following week and a request to contribute a pie to the Harvest Festival. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a beginning. Today, Sarah stood in her kitchen, rolling out dough for that very pie. The Harvest Festival was tomorrow, and she had promised Mrs. Wilson an apple pie made from the fruit of the old tree behind her cabin. Thomas sat on a quilt spread across the floor, playing with the small collection of toys he had accumulated. The wooden horse from Kohana, a rag doll from Mrs. Wilson, a little tin soldier that Mr. Harrington had carved during his long invalid hours. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Not Kohana, he always came on foot, silent as a shadow. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window, squinting against the afternoon light. Captain Munro sat astride his bay gelding, his uniform dusty from the trail, but his posture military straight. He was accompanied by another cavalryman, younger and unfamiliar, who looked around the small settlement with barely concealed disdain. Sarah felt a flicker of unease. Since that day in the town square, Munro had passed through Willow Creek twice, stopping briefly to check on her and Thomas each time. His visits were always cordial, respectful, but there was something in his manner today that sent a chill down her spine. "Thomas, stay here," she instructed, settling him more securely on his quilt before stepping onto the porch. Munro dismounted with the fluid grace of a lifelong horseman, handing his reins to the younger soldier. "Mrs. Matthews," he greeted her, removing his hat. "I hope I find you well." "Captain Munro," she replied. "This is an unexpected pleasure. Would you care for some coffee?" "I'd be grateful," he said, following her gesture toward the porch chairs. The younger soldier remained with the horses, his expression sullen. Sarah brought coffee for both men, though Munro's companion barely acknowledged her with a curt nod. Thomas, curious about the visitors, toddled to the door, but stayed inside as instructed, watching with wide eyes. "Fine boy," Munro observed, smiling at Thomas. "Growing like a weed." "He is," Sarah agreed. She sat across from Munro, studying his weathered face. "I don't think you've ridden all this way just to comment on my son's growth, Captain." Munro's smile faded. He set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his expression grave. "No, ma'am, I haven't." He glanced at his companion, then back to Sarah. "This is Lieutenant Crawford, newly assigned to Fort Whipple. He's brought news." Sarah's hands tightened around her cup. "What kind of news?" Crawford spoke for the first time. His voice clipped with the accent of the eastern seaboard. "There's been a raid on a supply wagon 3 days' ride west of here. 2 drivers killed, goods stolen." His cold eyes fixed on her. "Apache work." "I failed to see what this has to do with me," Sarah said carefully, though dread was building in her chest. Monroe cleared his throat. "There were witnesses, a hunting party from a nearby settlement. They described one of the raiders as unusually tall, wearing a cavalry hat." He paused, "and riding a distinctive pinto horse." Sarah's blood ran cold. Kahana's pinto was indeed distinctive, white with unusual copper-colored patches rather than the typical black. "Kahana would never be involved in such a thing," she said firmly. "He fought for the Union. He trades peacefully. He has been seen regularly visiting the widow of a white miner," Crawford interrupted, his tone dripping with insinuation. "A convenient arrangement, wouldn't you say? Perfect cover for gathering intelligence on troop movements, supply schedules." Sarah stood abruptly. "I think you should leave, Lieutenant." "Mrs. Matthews," Monroe said, his voice gentler than his companion's, but no less serious. "I've known Kahana for many years. I'd stake my life on his character, but there are complications." "What complications?" Monroe sighed heavily. "The raid occurred in Lieutenant Hollister's patrol area. He's convinced himself that Kahana was involved, possibly in revenge for the wrongful arrest of those Apache families. He's dispatched scouts to track him." Sarah felt as though the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. "They'll kill him." "Not if we find him first," Monroe said. "That's why I've come. Do you know where he might be?" Sarah shook her head, her thoughts racing. "He comes and goes. Sometimes he mentions fishing at Walnut Creek or hunting in the foothills, but—" She stopped, realizing too late that she might be giving away information that could harm him. Crawford snorted. "She's protecting him." "I'm telling you he's innocent," Sarah countered, her voice rising despite her effort to remain calm. Thomas, sensing her distress, began to cry from inside the cabin. Monroe stood, placing a restraining hand on Crawford's arm when the younger man made to speak again. "Mrs. Matthews, I believe you, and I believe in Kahana's innocence. But Hollister has the Colonel's ear, and he's painted a convincing picture. If those scouts find Kahana before we do—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Sarah knew all too well what happened to Apache men accused of raiding, whether guilty or innocent. A rope, a tree, and precious few questions asked. "What can I do?" she asked, moving to the door to soothe Thomas. "If he comes here, keep him here," Monroe said urgently. "I'm heading to the Riverlands to speak with Nasha's people. They might know where he is. I'll return as soon as I can." Crawford remained on the porch as Monroe moved toward his horse. "Captain," he called, his voice tight with disapproval, "we have orders to return directly to the fort." "And we will, Lieutenant," Monroe replied evenly, "after we've prevented a grave injustice." He mounted his horse, then looked down at Sarah with genuine concern. "Be careful, Mrs. Matthews. Hollister has men in town. They're watching your cabin." With that ominous warning, he wheeled his horse and rode out, Crawford following reluctantly behind. Sarah stood on the porch, Thomas now quiet in her arms, watching until the dust from their horses' hooves settled back to earth. Her mind raced with fear and uncertainty. Hollister was watching her cabin. Kahana was in danger, and she had no way to warn him. "Abba, come?" Thomas asked, his small face serious as he patted her cheek. "I don't know, sweetheart," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "But we have to be brave now. Very brave." She carried Thomas inside, her pie forgotten on the kitchen table. Moving to the window, she carefully peered out, scanning the street and nearby buildings. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then a slight movement caught her eye. A figure shifting position in the shadows between the livery stable and the blacksmith's shop. Another man sat casually on a barrel outside the general store, seemingly engaged in whittling but positioned with a clear view of her cabin. They were indeed being watched. Night was approaching, the shadows lengthening across Willow Creek. Sarah lit the lamps in her cabin one by one, moving with deliberate normalcy in case watchful eyes could see through her windows. She fed Thomas his supper, bathed him in the small tin tub by the fire, dressed him in his nightshirt, and sang him to sleep with trembling voice. Only when she was certain he was deeply asleep did she allow herself to cry, silent tears of fear and frustration. If Kohana came tonight, as he sometimes did after Thomas was asleep, bringing some small gift or offering to fix something around the cabin, if he walked into town unaware of the danger, a soft tap at her back door nearly stopped her heart. Sarah froze, listening intently. It came again, 3 soft taps, a pause, then 2 more. Kohana's signal. She moved silently through the darkened kitchen, her hand shaking as she lifted the latch. Kohana slipped inside like a shadow, his tall frame somehow managing to fold itself through the low doorway without a sound. In the dim light of the banked fire, his face was all planes and angles, his dark eyes reflecting the faint glow. "Sarah," he said softly, "you are afraid." It wasn't a question. He could read her as easily as she could the pages of her Bible. Without thinking, she threw her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest. His heart beat strong and steady beneath her cheek. After a moment's hesitation, his arms encircled her, one hand coming up to stroke her hair with infinite gentleness. They stood like that in the darkness, holding each other as if the world outside might tear them apart at any moment. Because, Sarah realized with terrible clarity, it very well might. "They're looking for you," Sarah whispered against the rough cotton of Kohana's shirt. She pulled back slightly, her hands gripping his arms as if to anchor him there. "Lieutenant Hollister has men watching the cabin. They're saying you were part of a raid on a supply wagon. 2 men dead." Kohana's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, but a weariness that spoke of a man accustomed to such accusations. "When?" he asked, his voice low. 3 days ago, west of here," Sarah replied, leading him further from the windows, deeper into the shadows of the kitchen. "Captain Monroe came to warn me. He doesn't believe it, but Hollister has scouts tracking you." Kohana nodded slowly. 3 days ago, I was hunting in the high valleys, alone." The firelight caught the angles of his face as he moved. No witnesses. The simple statement hung between them, heavy with implication. No witnesses meant no one to verify his innocence, no one but her, and her word would count for nothing against Hollister's determination. "You need to leave," Sarah said, though the words tore at her. "Go far from here until Monroe can prove it wasn't you." Kohana studied her face, his gaze penetrating. "And you, Thomas? What happens when I go?" Sarah hadn't considered that. In her fear for Kohana, she hadn't thought about what his absence might mean for her and Thomas. The town's tentative acceptance, Mrs. Wilson's protection, the fragile normalcy they'd been building, all of it balanced on the edge of a knife. "We'll be fine," she said, without conviction. Kohana shook his head slightly. "Hollister is not a man who accepts defeat. If he cannot find me—" He left the sentence unfinished, but Sarah understood. If Hollister couldn't punish Kohana directly, he would look for other targets. "Then we all go," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Thomas and I will come with you." Kohana's eyes widened, the most open expression of surprise she had ever seen on his stoic face. "Sarah, my people live hard, always moving, always watching, no proper home for a white woman and child." "Is death a proper home?" she countered, her voice still hushed but fierce. "Because that's what awaits you if you stay. And without you—" She swallowed hard. "Thomas needs you. I need you." It was the first time she had spoken such words aloud, admitted the depth of what had grown between them over these months. In the shadowed quiet of her kitchen, with danger pressing close outside, the truth seemed to demand acknowledgement. Kohana reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. "You would leave everything for me." "What do I have here but memories and judgment?" Sarah asked. "Robert is gone. His dreams died with him. But Thomas is alive, and so am I, and so are you." She covered his hand with hers, pressing it more firmly against her cheek. "We could make a new life, somewhere far from here." For a long moment, Kohana was silent, his face unreadable in the dim light. Then he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "There is a place, north in the high country, a valley where streams run clear all year, good hunting, good place to hide." He hesitated. "My father's people lived there once, before the soldiers came." "Is it safe?" Sarah asked. "Safer than here," he replied, "but the journey is hard. Snow comes early in the mountains." "When do we leave?" Kohana's expression softened, a mixture of admiration and concern. "You are sure? Once we go, no coming back." Sarah thought of her small cabin, of Robert's grave on the hillside, of the life she had expected to live. Then she looked toward the room where Thomas slept peacefully, innocent of the dangers gathering around them. "I'm sure," she said. Kohana nodded once, decision made. "Tonight, when the moon sets, pack only what you can carry. I will bring horses." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Sarah." She waited, but he seemed unable to find the words. Instead, he bent down and pressed his lips to her forehead, a gesture so tender, so reverent, that tears sprang to her eyes. "I will return," he promised, then slipped out into the darkness as silently as he had entered. Sarah stood motionless in the kitchen, her heart racing. What had she done? Agreed to abandon her home, her community, everything familiar, to flee into the wilderness with a man the army was hunting as a killer? Was it madness? Desperation? Or was it perhaps the most honest choice she had ever made? She had no time to dwell on questions without answers. Moving quickly but quietly, she gathered essentials: warm clothing for Thomas, a blanket, dried food, her sewing kit, the small Bible her mother had given her. What else did one take when leaving a life behind? As she worked, a sound from outside froze her in place, the distinctive creak of her front gate. Someone was in the yard. Sarah extinguished the lamp and crept to the window, peering cautiously through a gap in the curtains. A uniformed figure stood on her porch, hand raised to knock. Behind him, several more men waited at the gate, their shapes dark against the moonlit street. The knock, when it came, was sharp and authoritative. "Mrs. Matthews, this is Lieutenant Hollister. Open up, please. We need to talk about your Apache friend." Sarah pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling the sound that threatened to escape. Thomas stirred in his sleep, murmuring softly. Outside, Hollister knocked again, harder. "Mrs. Matthews, I know you're in there. Open this door or I'll have my men break it down." Sarah looked frantically around the cabin, at her half-packed bundle, at her sleeping son, at the back door through which Kohana had disappeared. The night suddenly seemed very long, and morning impossibly distant. "Final warning, Mrs. Matthews. Open up in the name of the United States Army." Sarah gathered Thomas into her arms, wrapping him in his blanket as he blinked sleepily. She glanced once more at her half-finished preparations, then squared her shoulders and moved to the door. "One moment, Lieutenant," she called, striving to keep her voice steady. She took a deep breath, then opened the door just enough to see Hollister's face in the moonlight. "May I ask why you're pounding on my door at this hour?" she asked, clutching Thomas to her chest. The baby whimpered, disturbed from his sleep. Hollister's gaze swept past her, scanning what he could see of the cabin interior. "I apologize for the hour, Mrs. Matthews, but this is a matter of some urgency." His tone belied any actual remorse. "May we come in?" "My son is sleeping, Lieutenant. Whatever you need to discuss can be said here." Hollister's jaw tightened. "Very well. When did you last see Kahana?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I don't keep track of his comings and goings, Lieutenant." "Don't play games, Mrs. Matthews. Everyone in town knows he visits regularly." Hollister took a step closer, forcing Sarah to tilt her head up to maintain eye contact. "He's wanted for questioning in connection with the murder of 2 U.S. Army supply drivers." "Kahana is not a murderer," Sarah said, her voice firmer than she felt. "That's for a military tribunal to decide, Ma'am." Hollister's eyes narrowed. "Now I'll ask you again. When did you last see him?" Before Sarah could respond, Thomas fully awoke, his small face scrunching up as he began to cry. "Ah, bah," he sobbed, reaching over Sarah's shoulder toward the darkness beyond. "Ah, bah." Hollister's expression changed, a cruel smile touching his lips. "Well now, seems the boy knows something you don't." He turned to the men waiting in the yard. "Search the property, every corner, every shadow." Sarah stepped forward, blocking the doorway as best she could with her small frame. "You have no right." "I have every right," Hollister interrupted, producing a folded paper from his jacket. "Written authorization to search any property suspected of harboring a wanted individual." Thomas continued to cry, his little body shaking with sobs. "Mama, Abba." "Touching, isn't it?" Hollister said, watching the baby with cold eyes. "How attached he's become to the savage. One might wonder what other attachments have formed in this household." The insinuation burned like acid. Sarah clutched Thomas closer, fighting the urge to slap the lieutenant's smug face. "I'll thank you to keep your vile implications to yourself, sir." "Mrs. Matthews!" The sharp, authoritative voice cut through the tension like a knife. Sarah turned to see Mrs. Wilson striding up the path, her grey hair hastily pinned beneath a shawl, her expression thunderous. Behind her came Mr. Wilson and, surprisingly, Reverend Collins. "What is the meaning of this?" Mrs. Wilson demanded, positioning herself between Sarah and Hollister with the air of a general taking the field. "Disturbing a widow and her child at this ungodly hour. Have you no decency, Lieutenant?" Hollister's face flushed. "This is army business, ma'am. I suggest you return home." "And I suggest you remember you're in a civilian settlement," countered Mr. Wilson, his normally mild manner replaced by firm resolve. "Your jurisdiction here is limited at best. We're searching for a murderer," Hollister insisted. "You're searching for a man who hasn't been tried or convicted of anything," Reverend Collins said, stepping forward. "A man who served the Union honorably during the war, as I understand it." Sarah stared at the Reverend in astonishment. He caught her eye and gave a slight nod. "Captain Monroe paid me a visit earlier today. Most enlightening." "Monroe should mind his own business," Hollister muttered. "Protecting innocent men from false accusations is every decent person's business," Mrs. Wilson declared. She turned to Sarah, her expression softening. "My dear, why don't you bring Thomas to our home for the night? Let these gentlemen conduct their fruitless search without disturbing the child further." Sarah hesitated, torn between gratitude for this unexpected support and fear of leaving her home when Kahana might return at any moment. "That's very kind, but I insist," Mrs. Wilson said firmly, in a tone that brooked no argument. She lowered her voice. "Thomas will be safer with us, and perhaps others might find it easier to move about without a child's cries to guide them." Understanding dawned in Sarah's eyes. Mrs. Wilson knew. Somehow she knew about the escape plans, or at least suspected them. "Mrs. Matthews isn't going anywhere," Hollister interjected. "Not until we've completed our search and interrogation." "Interrogation?" Reverend Collins echoed incredulously. This is a respectable widow, Lieutenant, not some criminal. Anyone harboring a fugitive becomes an accomplice, Hollister replied coldly. Then you'll need to arrest half the town, Mrs. Wilson said, her chin lifting defiantly. Starting with me. I've given that man coffee on my porch and medicine for the child. Will you drag an old woman to Fort Whipple for such heinous crimes? Hollister's face contorted with frustration. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. His men had paused in their search, watching the confrontation uncertainly. "Lieutenant," one of them called from the side of the cabin, "there's no sign of anyone here." For a moment, Hollister looked as though he might explode with rage. Then, visibly mastering himself, he straightened his uniform jacket. "This isn't over, Mrs. Matthews, not by a long shot." He turned on his heel and stalked away, gesturing sharply for his men to follow. As the soldiers retreated down the path, Sarah's knees nearly buckled with relief. Thomas had quieted, his little head heavy against her shoulder. Mrs. Wilson placed a steadying hand under her elbow. "Come, my dear," she said gently. "The night isn't over yet." At the Wilsons' house, Sarah sat by the fire, Thomas finally sleeping in her arms. Mrs. Wilson bustled about, gathering supplies with quiet efficiency, food, blankets, a small medicine kit. "How did you know?" Sarah asked softly. Mrs. Wilson paused, a sad smile touching her weathered face. "My sister ran away with a Cherokee man when I was just a girl. My father disowned her. I never saw her again." She wrapped a loaf of bread in cloth, tucking it into a canvas bag. "I've regretted my silence every day since." "I never expected such kindness," Sarah admitted. "After all the gossip, the judgment." People fear what they don't understand," Mrs. Wilson replied. "But fear isn't the only force in this world, thank God." She handed Sarah a leather pouch. "There's money inside. Not much, but enough to help you start somewhere new." "I can't accept—" "You can and you will," Mrs. Wilson interrupted firmly. "Consider it Thomas's inheritance from his Willow Creek family." The back door opened, and Reverend Collins entered, followed by Mr. Wilson. The Reverend's face was grave. "Hollister's posted men on all roads leading out of town. He's determined to catch Kohana before Monroe returns." Sarah's heart sank. "Then we're trapped." "Not necessarily," Mr. Wilson said. He spread a rough map on the table. "There's an old mining trail here through Eagle Canyon, hardly used these days. Steep but passable with care. It leads north, toward the high country." "Kohana mentioned a valley to the north," Sarah said, "where his father's people once lived." Reverend Collins nodded. "I know of such places, remote, peaceful." He hesitated. "Mrs. Matthews, I must ask, are you certain of this path? Life among the Apache will not be easy." Sarah looked down at Thomas, at his small face peaceful in sleep, his tiny hand curled around a lock of her hair. "Life is never easy, Reverend, but I've learned that home isn't a place. It's the people who stand beside you when the world turns cold." A soft knock at the window startled them all. Mr. Wilson moved to the curtain, peered out, then quickly opened the back door. Captain Monroe slipped inside, his uniform dusty, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Mrs. Matthews," he said, removing his hat, "I came as soon as I could. Nash's people confirmed what we suspected. Kohana was nowhere near the supply wagons when they were attacked. He was hunting elk in the high valleys." "Can you prove it?" Sarah asked, hope rising in her chest. Monroe's expression fell. "Unfortunately, no. It's their word against Hollister's witnesses, who I might add have been paid handsomely for their testimony." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I've sent word to Fort Whipple requesting a formal inquiry, but these things take time. Time Kohana doesn't have." "Then our plan hasn't changed," Sarah said. "We leave tonight." "Where is Kohana now?" Monroe asked. "Getting horses," Sarah replied. He'll meet us at moonset, which is less than an hour away, Mrs. Wilson observed, glancing at the mantel clock. Monroe nodded decisively. I'll escort you to the rendezvous point. My presence might discourage any overzealous actions on Hollister's part. You'd risk your career for this? Reverend Collins asked, studying the captain with newfound respect. For justice? For a man who saved my life? Yes, Reverend, I would. Monroe's scarred face was resolute. I've seen too many good men die because fear spoke louder than truth. A low whistle drifted through the open window, 3 notes rising and falling like a nightbird's call. Mrs. Wilson moved to look outside, then turned with a smile. Your escort has arrived, my dear. Sarah peered through the curtain. At the edge of the Wilsons' garden, barely visible in the shadows of the apple trees, stood Kohana. 3 horses waited behind him, saddled and ready. The time had come. Sarah gathered Thomas closer, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what they were about to do. Mrs. Wilson embraced her fiercely. Right when you can, the older woman whispered, just to let us know you're safe. I will, Sarah promised, blinking back tears. Reverend Collins approached, a leather-bound Bible in his hands. I thought you might want this, he said, pressing it into her free hand. The Lord's word knows no boundaries of race or custom. Thank you, Sarah said, touched by the gesture. Go with God, Mrs. Matthews, he replied. Then with a slight smile he added, or whatever name you choose to take in your new life. Monroe led the way through the back garden, his hand on his pistol, eyes constantly scanning the darkness. Sarah followed, Thomas wrapped snugly against the night chill. Mr. Wilson brought up the rear, carrying the supplies his wife had gathered. When they reached the tree line, Kohana stepped forward from the shadows. His eyes went first to Thomas, his expression softening at the sight of the sleeping child. Then he looked at Sarah, a question in his gaze. I'm ready, she said simply. Kohana nodded, then turned to Monroe with a warrior's respect. Old friend. Not so old, Monroe replied with a faint smile, but perhaps a bit wiser. He extended his hand, which Kohana clasped firmly. I've sent word to the fort. This injustice won't stand. Truth has its own time, Kohana said. We will wait for it in the high country. They worked quickly, securing the supplies to one of the horses, a sturdy paint mare. The second horse, Kohana's distinctive pinto, would carry Sarah and Thomas. The third, a tall black gelding with a white blaze, was for Kohana himself. Eagle Canyon is your best route, Monroe said, pointing north. Follow the old mining trail until it meets the high creek, then head west along the ridgeline. Kohana nodded, already familiar with the path. He helped Sarah mount, passing Thomas up to her once she was settled. The baby stirred but didn't wake, nestling against his mother in the saddle. Hollister's men are watching the main roads, Monroe continued. I'll create a distraction to draw them south, away from your route. Be careful, Sarah said. Hollister won't forget this. Neither will I, Monroe replied with a grim smile. Now go, quickly. Kohana swung onto his horse with fluid grace, gathering the reins of the pack horse. He looked down at Monroe, at the Wilsons standing a few paces away, at Reverend Collins with his hands folded as if in prayer. Thank you, he said simply. May the spirits watch over you. With that, he clicked softly to his horse, and they moved off into the darkness, 3 shadows melting into the deeper shadow of the forest. They rode in silence, Kohana leading the way along barely visible trails, avoiding the main paths where Hollister's men might lurk. Thomas slept against Sarah's chest, his small body warm and trusting. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the black velvet sky. As they climbed higher into the foothills, Sarah looked back once at the twinkling lights of Willow Creek, spread below them like fallen stars. Robert's grave was there, on the hillside overlooking the town. She would never stand beside it again, never lay flowers on the simple wooden cross. Yet strangely, the thought brought more peace than pain. Robert would always be Thomas's father by blood, part of their story, but life moved forward, like the river flowing from the mountains. The distant sound of hoofbeats broke her reverie. Kohana reined in sharply, raising a hand for silence. They listened as the sounds grew louder, multiple riders moving fast. "Hollister," Kohana said grimly, "coming this way." Sarah's heart raced. They were exposed on the trail with nowhere to hide. How did they know? "Does not matter now," Kohana replied. "We ride. Faster." They urged their horses forward, climbing higher into the rocky terrain. The hoofbeats behind them grew steadily louder. Thomas awoke, startled by the sudden pace, and began to cry. "Shh, little one," Sarah soothed, pressing him close. "All will be well." The trail narrowed, winding between towering boulders. Ahead, a steep path climbed toward a ridge silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Below, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. "There!" A shout echoed from behind them. Up on the ridge, a shot rang out, the bullet whining off rock somewhere to their left. Thomas screamed in terror. "Keep going," Kohana ordered, pulling alongside Sarah. "To the ridge, I will hold them." "No!" Sarah protested. "We stay together!" But Kohana had already wheeled his horse around, rifle in hand. "Go!" he commanded. "Protect our son!" Our son. The words gave Sarah strength, even as fear threatened to overwhelm her. She urged her horse forward, up the steep trail toward the ridge. Behind her, she heard Kohana's rifle crack once, twice. The pursuers' shots answered, echoing off the canyon walls. The ridge loomed closer, a dark line against the night sky. Sarah's horse struggled up the final slope, rocks clattering beneath its hooves. Thomas clung to her, his small body shaking with sobs. At the top of the ridge, Sarah reined in, turning to look back. In the faint starlight, she could make out figures on the trail below, Hollister's men, their forms shadowy in the darkness. Of Kohana, there was no sign. "No," she whispered, despair washing over her. "Please, no." She was alone, with her terrified child, on a mountaintop in the wilderness. Hollister's men would reach her soon. There was nowhere left to run. A shadow moved to her right. Sarah turned, hope and fear warring in her heart. Kohana emerged from behind a stand of juniper, leading his horse. He moved swiftly to her side, his face grim in the starlight. "You're alive," she breathed. "They stopped to regroup," he said. "We have minutes, no more." He took Thomas from her arms, cradling the boy against his chest. Immediately, the child's sobs quieted to hiccuping breaths. "Abba," Thomas whimpered, his small hands clutching at Kohana's buckskin vest. "Yes, little warrior," Kohana murmured, pressing his cheek against the boy's head. "I am here." Sarah felt a knot in her throat at the sight. This strong, fierce man, so gentle with her son. Whatever happened next, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. "What now?" she asked. Kohana pointed west along the ridge. "There is a path, hidden among rocks, leads to high valleys, hard to follow, even in daylight." "And Hollister's men?" "We'll follow our tracks to here," Kohana replied, "then lose the trail on stone." New sounds drifted up from below, men shouting, horses being urged up the steep path. Their time was running out. "Go," Sarah said suddenly. "Take Thomas, I'll lead them away." Kohana stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "No, listen to me," she insisted. "I'm a white woman. They won't shoot me. I'll lead them east while you take Thomas west. I'll tell them you forced me to come, that I escaped. They'll believe that." "Sarah, he needs you," she interrupted, touching Thomas's cheek. "If they catch us all, what happens to him? An orphanage, a life of shame as the savage's boy." Kohana's jaw tightened, the truth of her words hitting home. For a long moment he was silent, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, with infinite tenderness, he placed Thomas back in her arms. "We stay together," he said firmly. "Family does not separate." Family. The word washed over Sarah like a blessing. "Then we'd better hurry," she said, blinking back tears. They moved swiftly along the ridge, leaving the horses behind to confuse their pursuers. Kohana led the way, one hand always reaching back to steady Sarah as they climbed over rocks and pushed through dense underbrush. Thomas, sensing the urgency, remained quiet in his mother's arms. Dawn was breaking when they finally stopped, hidden in a small box canyon high above the valley. Far below, they could see tiny figures on horseback, still searching the lower slopes. But they had lost the trail, just as Kohana had predicted. Sarah sat on a flat rock, exhaustion finally catching up with her. Thomas had fallen asleep again, his small face peaceful against her shoulder. Kohana knelt beside them, his hand gently stroking the boy's dark hair. "What now?" Sarah asked, watching the search parties in the distance. "We rest," Kohana replied. "When night comes, we go north. 2 days' journey to the valley. Safe there." Sarah nodded, too tired to speak. She leaned against Kohana's shoulder, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I'm sorry," she said after a while, "for the life you had to leave behind." Kohana's arm came around her, drawing her closer. "I leave nothing behind," he said simply. "All I need is here." Sarah looked up at him, at the strong profile etched against the lightening sky. This man who had walked into her life on a dusty street and changed everything. This man who had chosen her son and her as his family. "In my people's way," Kohana said quietly, "a father is not just blood. A father is one who teaches, who protects, who loves." He looked down at Thomas, his expression softening. "I will be father to this child if you permit." "He already knows who you are," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "He chose you before either of us realized it." As if in confirmation, Thomas stirred in his sleep, one small hand reaching out to grasp Kohana's finger. "Abba," he murmured dreamily. Kohana's face transformed, a smile of such tenderness breaking across his usually stern features that Sarah's heart ached with love for them both. He bent to kiss Thomas's forehead, then hesitantly, Sarah's. "We have hard journeys still," he said, "but we will make home together." Sarah nodded, looking out over the vast wilderness spread before them. Somewhere beyond those distant mountains lay their future, uncertain, challenging, but theirs to build together. The sun broke fully over the horizon, painting the world in gold and promise. Thomas slept peacefully between them, one hand holding his mother's, the other still wrapped trustingly around his father's finger. And in that moment, on a mountainside far from the world they'd known, Sarah Matthews realized they had already found their home, not in a place, but in each other. They had become a family. Years later, travelers in the high country would sometimes speak of a remote valley where crystal streams ran through meadows bright with wildflowers. They told of a cabin built in the shadow of ancient pines, of gardens tended by a woman with sun-brightened hair, of a tall Apache who hunted the forests with a bow of incredible craftsmanship. And they spoke of a boy who moved between two worlds with grace and confidence, who spoke the tongue of both his fathers, who carried himself with the dignity of his Apache heritage and the compassion of his mother's heart. A young man who would one day become a bridge between peoples, just as he himself was the living proof of love's power to transcend boundaries of blood and custom. For Thomas Matthews, or Takiom, Laughing Water, as he was also called, was neither half of one world nor half of another. He was wholly himself, the cherished son of a mother brave enough to follow her heart and a father wise enough to know that family is created not just by birth, but by choice, by love. And in the end, that was all that mattered.